I lay in bed that night, exhausted from a long day at work. My eyelids grew heavy, and I was on the verge of drifting off. The room was wrapped in darkness, except for a faint sliver of moonlight slipping through the curtains. The quiet of the house felt comforting. I lived with two housemates, Sarah and Henry, but they were both out for the night. Sarah had gone to visit her parents, and Henry was staying over at his girlfriend's place. I was looking forward to a peaceful evening alone. Just as I was about to surrender to sleep, a soft creak echoed from the hallway. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, and in the dimness, I caught sight of a shadow shifting. I assumed one of my housemates had returned early, but then something odd happened. The door slowly pushed open a little wider. A head peeked in. The darkness obscured the details, but I could make out the vague silhouette of a person. They lingered for a moment, staring at me, then quickly pulled back and shut the door. More irritated than frightened, I sighed. They didn't even bother to knock. Annoyed, I got up to see who it was, assuming Sarah or Henry had forgotten something and come back. I flicked on my bedside lamp, its warm glow spreading across the room, and stepped toward the door. When I entered the hallway, silence greeted me. The house felt still, too still. "Sarah? Henry?" I called out. No response. I walked through the living room and kitchen, checking for any signs of movement, but everything was exactly as I had left it. The lights were off, and no one was there. A chill crept up my spine. If one of them had returned, where were they now? Feeling uneasy, I returned to my room and grabbed my phone. I texted Sarah first, "Hey, are you home? I thought I saw you." Minutes passed with no reply. I tried Henry next, "Are you here? I think I saw someone." Again, nothing. My pulse quickened. I decided to check the doors. The front door was locked, just as I had left it. I hurried to the back door. Also locked. My mind raced. If both entrances were secure, how had anyone gotten in? With growing unease, I stepped back into the hallway, scanning every shadowed corner. Maybe I had imagined it. I was exhausted, and my mind could have been playing tricks on me. But it had felt so real. Just to be sure, I decided to check every room. I started with Sarah's. Her door was shut, and when I opened it, everything appeared untouched. Her bed was neatly made, nothing out of place. I moved to Henry's room. His door was also closed. I pushed it open and was met with his usual chaos, scattered clothes and books, but nothing to suggest someone had been there recently. Growing more anxious, I checked the bathroom and the small storage room. Both were empty. I sat back down on my bed, telling myself it was all in my head. But then, I heard it again. That same quiet creak in the hallway. My breath caught. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I turned off my bedside lamp and listened. The silence of the house was so deep that I could hear my own heartbeat. Then the creaking grew louder, like slow, deliberate footsteps coming toward my room. I wanted to get up, to confront whoever was there, but fear pinned me in place. Suddenly, the door cracked open again, just like before. A shadow loomed beyond it. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it toward the door. Nothing. The hallway was empty. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Something was seriously wrong. I quickly dialed Sarah's number, desperate to hear a familiar voice. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried Henry next. The phone rang and rang, but no answer. A shaky breath escaped me. "Henry, if you get this, please call me. I think someone's in the house." I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to call the police only to end up looking like a fool if it turned out to be nothing. But the thought of staying alone in that house was unbearable. I locked my bedroom door and pushed a chair against it for extra security. Then I sat on my bed, gripping my phone like a lifeline. Every passing minute stretched unbearably long as I listened to the silence, my flashlight still trained on the door. My mind kept replaying what I had seen, the way that head had peered in before vanishing. Who was it? What did they want? Then, finally, a sound. The front door unlocking. My heart pounded. I bolted upright, adrenaline surging through my veins. A familiar voice rang out. "Hey, you home?" Henry. Relief flooded me. I scrambled to my door, shoving the chair aside and yanking it open. There he stood in the hallway, looking at me with confusion. "What's going on?" he asked. I spilled everything, the noises, the shadow, the creeping door. He listened intently, then, in an attempt to reassure me, checked the house again. We found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No indications that anyone else had been there. "Maybe it was just your imagination," Henry suggested. I wanted to believe him. But even after he went to his room and I tried to sleep, the unease lingered. The creaks in the floorboards, the shifting darkness in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me that night. From that moment on, I never slept with my door unlocked. And I always left a light on. Underscore 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 underscore. A few years later, I was working as a pizza delivery driver. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills. One cold, drizzly night, I had a delivery on the other side of town. It was football night, so the streets were packed with fans celebrating and traffic was heavier than usual. The order itself was standard, a large pepperoni pizza with extra cheese and a side of garlic bread. I remember that night vividly. The air was damp, my windshield fogged up, and classic rock hummed from the radio as I made my way through town. By the time I reached the address, I was only a few minutes past the promised delivery time. I pulled up to the house, grabbed the pizza, and walked up to the door. Oddly, the place was completely dark. No lights on. No movement inside. I knocked. A long pause followed before the door creaked open just a sliver. A man peered out, his face mostly swallowed by shadow. "You're late," he said in a rough voice. I glanced at my watch. "Only by a few minutes," I replied, keeping my tone polite. "Sorry about that." The door creaked open wider, and I caught sight of 3 other men standing behind him. Their rough, hardened faces sent a wave of unease through me. Before I could react, the first man lunged forward, grabbing my shirt and yanking me inside. "Hey!" I shouted, but my voice came out weak and shaky. They shoved me against the wall, and before I could even think of resisting, I felt something cold press against my neck. My breath hitched as I glanced down, a knife, glinting in the dim light, held firmly in the man's hand. "Give us your money," he ordered, his voice low and threatening. My heart pounded as I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out the cash I had earned from the night's deliveries. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The man with the knife grinned, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. "That's it," he sneered. I nodded, my throat too dry to answer. He took a step back, still gripping the knife, while the others closed in and roughly searched my pockets. They found my phone and snatched it away, adding to their haul. "Please," I managed to choke out. "Just let me go. I won't say anything." They laughed, their amusement at my fear sending a cold shiver down my spine. One of them slapped me hard on the back, the force nearly knocking me forward. "Sure you won't," he said mockingly. I lost track of how long they kept me there, taunting and intimidating me. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Eventually, though, they seemed to grow bored. The man with the knife gave me one last long look before jerking his head toward the door. "Get out of here," he muttered. I didn't need to be told twice. Stumbling toward the door, I bolted outside and ran straight to my car. My hands were trembling so violently that I struggled to fit the key into the ignition. After what felt like an eternity, the engine roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back. When I returned to the pizza shop, I recounted everything to my boss. His face paled as he picked up the phone and called the police. I gave my statement, describing every detail I could remember about the men in the house. For days after, I was on edge. Every unexpected noise sent my heart racing. I barely slept, haunted by the memory of the knife at my throat. Then, a week later, the police called. "We got them," the officer said. Relief crashed over me. They were repeat offenders, known troublemakers in the area, and I had just been unlucky enough to cross their path. I was asked to come to the station and confirm their identities. I did, and there was no doubt. It was them. Months later, another call came. The case had gone to trial, and they had been found guilty. They were going to prison. Before ending the call, the officer mentioned something else. "We recovered some of your money," he said. "You can come pick it up." I wasn't expecting much, but when I arrived at the station and was handed an envelope with my hard-earned cash inside, it wasn't about the money, it was about closure. Those men were off the streets. I could finally breathe again. Underscore 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 underscore. It was a quiet, freezing night at the gas station where I worked. The clock on the wall read 1:45 a.m., and the only sounds came from the soft hum of the coolers and the occasional car rolling down the empty road. I sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, trying to fight off the creeping exhaustion. The graveyard shift was always slow, and I was counting down the minutes until my shift ended at 3 a.m. Then, the door chime rang. I looked up. A man walked in. Tall and thin, he wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face, casting deep shadows over his features. Something about him put me on edge immediately. Maybe it was the way he moved, too slow, too deliberate, or the way his eyes roamed the store like he was scanning it for something. He approached the counter. "Pack of cigarettes," he muttered, his voice rough and gravelly. A chill ran down my spine. I turned, grabbed a pack from the shelf, and placed it in front of him. He didn't pick it up right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, handing it to me. When our hands brushed, a jolt of icy dread shot through me. I quickly rang up the purchase, handed him his change, and watched as he stuffed it into his pocket without counting it. Then, as if remembering something, he spoke again. $20 on pump 3. I nodded, entered the amount, and handed him the receipt. "Thanks," he said in that same unsettling tone before turning and walking out. I watched through the window as he pumped gas into his battered, old car. The way he moved, the way he had scanned the store, it all felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just crossed paths with someone truly dangerous. After he drove away, I tried to return to my magazine, but my mind kept replaying our interaction. My eyes flicked to the door every few minutes, half expecting him to come back. The rest of my shift crawled by, and when my replacement finally arrived, I left as fast as I could. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Groggy, I reached for it and stared at the headline. "Gas station robbed." Attendant brutally assaulted. My breath caught. Heart pounding, I read the article. The robbery had taken place just an hour after my shift ended, at a gas station only a few miles from mine. The suspect was described as tall, thin, wearing a dark hoodie. It was him. A cold sweat broke across my skin as the reality sank in. That man had stood right in front of me. If he had chosen my gas station instead, I might have been the one lying in a hospital bed. That night, going back to work was the last thing I wanted to do. Every time the door chime rang, I flinched, expecting to see that hooded figure again. The paranoia clung to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. A few days later, I saw his face again, this time on the front page of the newspaper. He had tried to rob another gas station but had been caught after a high-speed chase ended in a violent crash. The article included his mugshot, and I finally saw his face clearly. His eyes were cold. Empty. And on his lips, even in that booking photo, was the faint trace of a twisted smile. I scooped Jake up in my arms, his tiny hands still clutching a toy train as he let out a sleepy yawn. "All right, little guy, bedtime," I said, carrying him upstairs to his nursery. The room was softly lit by a small nightlight, casting gentle shadows along the walls. I changed him into his pajamas, read him a short bedtime story, and rocked him for a few minutes until his eyes fluttered shut. Once I was sure he was sound asleep, I carefully laid him in his crib, tucking the blanket around him. With Jake settled in for the night, I made my way back downstairs. The house was quiet now, except for the faint ticking of a clock in the hallway. I grabbed a blanket from the couch and curled up in front of the TV, flipping through channels until I landed on an old movie. About an hour passed, and I was just starting to get drowsy when I heard it, a soft thump from upstairs. My first thought was that Jake had shifted in his crib, maybe kicking the side in his sleep. But then I heard it again. A distinct, rhythmic tapping sound. Frowning, I muted the TV and listened. The noise seemed to be coming from the baby monitor sitting on the coffee table. I leaned in closer. The monitor crackled slightly, and then, through the static, I heard it, soft breathing. A chill crawled up my spine. I grabbed the monitor and stared at the small screen. The camera feed showed Jake's crib, just as I had left him. He was still there, curled up beneath his blanket. But something felt off. The crib was positioned near the window, and the curtains were slightly parted, revealing the darkness outside. Then I saw it. A shadow moved. Not inside the nursery, but outside. Someone was standing by the window. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to rush upstairs and grab Jake, but fear rooted me to the spot. The shadow lingered for a moment, then shifted out of sight. Heart pounding, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my phone and quickly dialed Mr. Smith's number. It rang once. Twice. Then, voicemail. I didn't want to waste time, so I called Mrs. Smith next. This time, she picked up on the second ring. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked, her voice cheerful. I swallowed hard. I think someone's outside the house," I whispered, trying not to panic. "What?" Her tone immediately changed. "Where?" "By Jake's window," I said, glancing back at the monitor. Jake was still asleep, undisturbed. I saw a shadow move. There was a moment of silence, then Mrs. Smith's voice came back, tense. "Lock the doors. We're calling the police. Stay inside." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Okay." I rushed to the front door, double-checking the lock, then did the same for the back door and the windows in the living room. My hands were shaking as I peeked through the curtains, but the yard was empty. Whoever it was, they were gone. Minutes passed like hours as I sat on the couch, gripping the baby monitor, listening for any sign of movement. Finally, flashing red and blue lights lit up the street outside. The police had arrived. I let them in and explained everything. 2 officers went outside to check the yard while another stayed with me, asking questions. A few minutes later, one of the officers returned. "No sign of anyone now," he said, but his expression was serious. "We did find footprints by the nursery window, though." I felt my stomach drop. The Smiths arrived shortly after, rushing inside with worry written all over their faces. Mrs. Smith ran upstairs to check on Jake, while Mr. Smith spoke with the officers. "The footprints lead back toward the woods behind the house," one of them told him. "We'll patrol the area, but we suggest installing some security cameras." That night, I stayed until the Smiths reassured me they'd be okay. They thanked me over and over for keeping Jake safe, but I still felt shaken. The thought of someone watching from the shadows while I was completely unaware made my skin crawl. I never babysat for the Smiths again. It wasn't their fault, but the memory of that night haunted me. From then on, I always checked the windows, always locked the doors, because I knew that sometimes, the scariest things weren't in ghost stories. They were real. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from upstairs, sending a chill down my spine. I muted the TV and sat frozen, listening intently. The rain continued tapping against the windows, but beyond that, the house was eerily silent. I lived alone. Forcing myself to stay rational, I told myself it was just the house settling. Old wood shifting in the damp weather. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The steps had been too deliberate, too steady. Summoning what little courage I had, I stood up and grabbed the closest thing resembling a weapon, a heavy flashlight from the coffee table. My pulse pounded in my ears as I slowly made my way to the staircase. I hesitated at the bottom, staring up into the dark hallway above. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, as I placed one foot on the first step. The floor creaked beneath me, the sound swallowed by the thick silence of the house. I took another step, then another. My breathing was shallow, my grip on the flashlight tightening. As I reached the top, I turned toward my bedroom. The door was slightly open. I was sure I had left it closed. A lump formed in my throat. I slowly nudged the door open with the flashlight, my other hand hovering over the light switch. With a flick, the room flooded with warm light. Nothing. The bed was undisturbed, my closet door shut. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. Maybe I was just exhausted. My mind playing tricks on me. Just as I started to relax, I heard it again. A soft shuffle. Not from my bedroom. From the guest room at the end of the hall. I turned toward the closed door, my stomach twisting into knots. The guest room had been empty for months. No one ever used it. My hands were sweating as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The air inside was ice cold. A strange, metallic scent filled my nose. I swept the flashlight beam across the room. And then I saw it. The closet door, wide open. Inside, nestled between old coats and forgotten boxes, something moved. A pair of eyes. Wide. Unblinking. Staring right at me. I gasped, stumbling backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure in the closet shifted slightly, the darkness obscuring its details. Then, in the dim light, I saw its mouth curl into a grin. I didn't wait to see anything else. I turned and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. My heart pounded as I grabbed my keys, yanked open the front door, and ran into the rain. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Fumbling with my keys, I jumped in, locked the doors, and turned on the engine. My headlights illuminated the house, the upstairs windows staring down at me like empty eyes. And then, a shadow moved past the window. I slammed the car into reverse and sped down the street, my hands shaking on the wheel. I drove for hours, too terrified to go back. When I finally returned in the daylight, I wasn't alone, I brought the police. They searched the house. No signs of forced entry. No footprints inside. And the guest room closet? Still open. But empty. The officers gave me a sympathetic look, telling me it was probably exhaustion or stress. That I had imagined it. But I knew what I saw. I knew I wasn't alone in that house. That night, I packed a bag and stayed in a hotel. A week later, I moved out. And to this day, I never stay anywhere with an open closet. Months later, I was closing up the cafe alone when the bell above the door jingled again. My heart clenched as I turned toward the entrance, half expecting to see him, the blood-soaked stranger, standing there once more. But it wasn't him. It was a police officer. He walked up to the counter, his face unreadable. "You working here that night?" he asked, his tone casual but firm. I swallowed, already knowing which night he meant. "Yeah," I replied. The man covered in blood. The officer nodded, pulling out a small notepad. "We've been trying to track him down for a while," he said. "You might be the last person who saw him before he disappeared." I frowned. "Disappeared?" The officer sighed, rubbing his temple. "We never found him. No reports of violence that matched his description, no missing persons that fit. It's like he walked into the night and never existed." That sent a fresh wave of unease through me. I thought back to the way he had stood at the counter, calm, almost polite, despite the horror of his appearance. I hesitated, then asked the question that had haunted me for months. "Whose blood was it?" The officer's expression darkened. He glanced around the cafe, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "We don't know," he admitted. "The blood samples we found outside didn't match anyone in our system. No victims. No crimes. Nothing." A cold shiver ran through me. "So what does that mean?" The officer shook his head. "Honestly, we have no idea." He left after that, thanking me for my time and asking me to call if I ever saw the man again. I nodded, but I already knew I wouldn't. The stranger had vanished into the night, just as mysteriously as he had arrived. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the cafe, wiping down the counters late at night, I still hear the bell jingle. I still feel that eerie, lingering presence. And I can't help but wonder. Did he ever really leave? I stood behind the counter, gripping the blood-stained note as a cold shiver ran through me. The cafe around me felt suddenly smaller, quieter, like the walls were pressing in. The words on the paper blurred as my hands trembled. The blood was from someone who had to be stopped. My mind raced with possibilities. Who had he killed? Was it self-defense? Revenge? Or something even darker? The letter gave no clues, no explanations, just a cryptic reassurance that, somehow, I had unknowingly played a part in something bigger. I looked up, hoping to catch sight of the woman who had delivered the message, but she was gone. Vanished as quickly as the stranger himself. For a long time, I just stood there, the letter clutched in my hands, the distant hum of the coffee machines the only sound in the cafe. I should have called the police. I should have handed them the note. But something in my gut told me it wouldn't matter. He was already gone. And whatever had happened that night, whatever terrible thing he had done, I would never get the full story. As time passed, I tried to push the memory away, to convince myself it was just another strange encounter, another bizarre chapter in the book of my late-night shifts. But I never could. Every so often, especially on cold, rainy nights, I'd glance toward the door, half expecting the bell to jingle and for him to walk in again, bloodied, calm, and looking for another cup of coffee. And every time, I wondered, had I really helped make the world a safer place? Or had I just given a monster one last kindness before he disappeared into the night?